Well, welcome everyone to the last Valley Water webinar of 2025. We're saving the best for last, perhaps. This is a webinar on how we create abundant gardens with Graywater.
So again, my name is Nick Samard. I'm a water conservation specialist here at Valley Water, and I'm just going to get right into it here. So why is conservation important? So obviously it saves you money, right? Water and utilities as a whole are not cheap. It ensures we have a continuous and reliable water supply, reduces the amount of water that we're going to need to import from the Sacramento Delta. Um, and then we want to again go back to that saves you money. I think a really rated way to really save money and water and energy is the water energy nexus that we have. So we're really going to be kind of tackling two big issues by saving water. You're also going to be saving some energy, and so that's great. Next slide, please. Water use in our county. So this is a little bit of a breakdown of where the water really goes in our county. So in terms of overall water use, about half is indoor and half is outdoor. Um, Most, if not all, the fixtures now are pretty updated. Hopefully, you have updated fixtures, and so there's a lot of a lot of active saving opportunities that we have on the outdoor side. So that's part of the intent with this webinar is to really showcase those opportunities of how you can save water on the outdoor end. Next slide, please. So this is the plethora of programs that Valley Water has to offer. We do have indoor conservation programs as well, and we also do a lot of education and outreach. And I'm going to get into a lot of these programs in the following slides. So, for example, if you live within Santa Clara County, rent or own, doesn't matter as long as the address is within the county, you can go to our online shopping cart and you can order free aerators, toilet flappers, shower heads, hose nozzles, leak detection tablets, see if you have a leak in the toilet, um, flow kit to see it's we call it our DIY kit, do it yourself kit, where you can find out, hey, here's the flow rate from this faucet and see if it's actually working to spec and what the manufacturer intended. Because yes, over time, your appliances and fixtures will slowly but surely break down. We also have some really great literature. So Pamela brought up that landscape guidelines, the sustainable landscape guidelines that G3 developed for us. We have that available on the shopping cart if you wanted that hard copy mailed to you. And I believe we do have it translated into two other languages as well. I know we're going to have some links that may be sprinkled throughout this presentation, and we'll be sharing those links at the end of the presentation or at the end of the webinar today. Um, Again, I mentioned we have our WaterWise outdoor surveys. So if you want us, Valley Water will send an irrigation specialist. We'll schedule a time to go to your property and really do a full irrigation audit and see if you need a tune-up and where that tune-up might be best placed. It'll also be able to say, identify places where, hey, you need a tune-up in this area and it qualifies for a rebate from our landscape rebate program. Um, I would say if you don't know where to start, let's say maybe you just bought a new property and you're not sure what you're working with, call us in for a WaterWise outdoor survey. Maybe you've had the property for a while and you don't know what you're working with still. Call us in for that WaterWise outdoor survey, and that will tell you what direction you can go into to really increase your water efficiency. We also have our large landscape program. So if there's anyone here who maybe manages or owns larger commercial sites, you have access to a portal that would essentially monitor your water usage for you, show you kind of what an ideal landscape irrigation budget would be for your site, and really gives you a lot of autonomy over what your water use will be. Next slide, please. And so I mentioned this earlier. I work really closely with our landscape rebate program. So there's a lot of elements to the rebate program. So for example, landscape conversions, if you want to remove your lawn, which we all should, and replace it with a low water use landscape, we'll give you $2 a square foot, up to $3,000 to do that. And you can see this really beautiful picture that we're sharing here on the screen. That would be an example of a totally acceptable landscape. through our rebate program. Again, as mentioning, if you maybe own or manage a business site, we do have our lawn to mulch rebate for those commercial, institutional, industrial sites as well, which is a lower amount. Um, we also have another element to landscape rebate program would be our irrigation upgrades you can make. So converting overhead irrigation into inline drip, upgrading overheads to high efficiency models, and then implementing irrigation controllers, smart weather-based irrigation controllers that can be paired with some really great um, other technologies such as flow sensors or rain sensors. Again, giving you a lot of autonomy over your landscape's irrigation, and giving you some fail safes as well. So, we issue rebates for all those items. Um, Next slide, please. Yeah, and I believe this was the last webinar we had was on rainwater capture, and it's pretty appropriate with the weather we've been having here. So we also issue rebates within our landscape rebate program for rain barrels, cisterns, or implementing rain gardens. And if you want to learn more about rainwater capture, you can go on our YouTube page. We recorded that webinar just like we're recording this one, and you can rewatch it there and learn. This is really great because this is why we're here to learn more about Graywater. So this is our laundry landscape rebate program. It is just for laundry to landscape systems only. The rebate is $200 to $400 depending on what part of the county you live in. And then we're going to learn more about this from Dr. Hasselbeck. But again, no permit is required with this, so there's a lot less barriers. It can be a lot more affordable to install, especially maybe if you're a DIY or a very handy person, or a handy person. This can be a pretty easy install. So. Um, yeah, so please reach out with questions in the Q&A. If you happen to see water waste throughout the county, we also have our water waste portal where you can report water waste totally anonymously as well, that you see. And then that site would get a educational letter letting them know about what water waste was observed. And I mean, you can see in this photo, it's pretty good example. They have a geyser going on in their front lawn sprinkler, and maybe they don't know about it because their irrigation system turns on at 5 a.m., right? And they go to work at 9 a.m. So, again, one of the neighbors saw and let us know about it. We're letting them know. They're going to get it fixed, saves them money, saves them water. It's a win-win in our books. Next slide, please. So we do have this slide for questions, but I'm going to go ahead and defer again to the Q&A, for you to put those questions in the Q&A chat. So, Pamela, I'm going to give it back to
Awesome.
you.
And if you would put this information into the chat, that would be great, because then people can just click on the link
You got it.
to connect with you. Thank you so much,
Perfect.
Nick.
Thanks, Pamela.
Always appreciate those previews. You get to see how much Valley Water is doing for their area, and it's really terrific. There's so many great things, and I would highly recommend that you take advantage of any rebates, but also any guidance that you can get from them, because it's all really excellent. Well, this evening's workshop is about Graywater, as we said, and you saw a slide that's very kind of similar to this. Previously, Nick mentioned that half of the water coming into your home is actually going into the landscape. So you can understand why Valley Water is spending so much energy on trying to reduce that water for you. It makes a big difference to you. And it also shows you just how big the opportunity might be to capture water from other indoor areas and utilize it in the landscape. So you can really see this is a big opportunity. And just wanted to make sure that everyone was kind of aware of this. Now, Northern California here is, no drought essentially. But when we talk about drought and we talk about the need for landscapes to be utilizing rainwater, gray water, and so forth, supplemental water that's other than the drinking water, you can really understand that even as recently as the beginning of November, there were still parts of California that were in severe drought. And severe drought is not eliminated by a few big rainstorms. It's something that can be quite pervasive. And so we move in and out of drought in this state, and utilizing rainwater and graywater is a really critical consideration for our landscapes. Now, I want to put in graywater into context. As you know, if you've taken classes with us before, and if you're new, welcome to the idea of treating your property as though it's a mini watershed. And essentially what that means is we are evaluating every single property that we have, and we are looking for where water falls on it, that would be the roof, and we are looking for where it leaves the property. And everything in between those 2 points, we get to make choices about and we get to control. And the way that we can actually improve that area that we can control is by applying 4 principles. We build healthy living soil, which is the most important thing we can do. We capture rainwater as a resource. We select climate appropriate plants that don't need a lot of water. And we use highly efficient supplemental irrigation. And that is really kind of where we are going to be talking this evening. Because for us, we have a kind of hierarchy of water sources for supplemental water. And the first one is that we capture water as passively as possible, which means we just make sure we don't have a flat yard anymore, and we hold as much water in the landscape as we possibly can. We build really healthy soil, and we hold on to that water for plants so that they can access it. And then the second kind of layer, sort of a little bit more difficult, is to capture rainwater actively, put it into a cistern and reutilize it. Another option is to utilize recycled water if it's available from your water provider. And a type of recycled water that you have coming from your own home is gray water. This is a supply that is coming from your fixtures. And so keep it on your property instead of letting it go off. And you can really think about using all of these options before you use drinking water, which is another word for potable water. So that's really where we kind of stand on this. It fits beautifully into the watershed approach, and that's why we prioritize thinking about gray water as a way to transition away from regular irrigation. So if you're using drinking water for your irrigation, gray water is a great alternative. And it can also help you to transition a conventional garden that maybe uses more water than a climate appropriate garden would. So it's a great way to bridge the gap, even if you're not, starting anew with a garden. So this evening's workshop is actually going to be presented by a guest speaker, and we want to welcome them. And have special thanks to Catching H2O, Dwelling on Carbon. And I want to introduce you now to Dr. Rosalind Hasselbeck. They received their PhD in biology from UC Irvine and spent several years teaching and leading student research at University of San Diego prior to becoming a water and carbon entrepreneur. They've been working on climate advocacy since 2005 and have founded several climate action green infrastructure companies, including Catching H2O, which was a C27 and a B contractor devoted to expanding installations of gray water and rainwater catchment systems in California and developing a green-blue workforce. They're now serving as executive director and founder of Dwelling on Carbon, a nonprofit organization and a C27 contractor focused on developing and implementing carbon sequestration projects and landscapes, of which Graywater is one. And I just want to say that Dr. Hasselbeck also serves as the head of science for my own project called Take Back the Turf, where we're directly installing polyculture lawns in residential and commercial settings. So it is with great pleasure that I introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. Rosalind Hasselbeck, to take it from here.
Thank you, Pamela. I'm very delighted to be here with all of you this evening and talking about one of my favorite subjects, which is gray water. And Why I love Graywater is that, first of all, that it is a source, as Pamela mentioned, of supplemental water, which is readily accessible, especially if you happen to be living in the Valley Water area, and you can take advantage of their rebate, which is fantastic. Um, but not only is it readily accessible and helps us to keep our urban landscapes as green as they need to be with plants, it's also an underused resource. And so I'm always really excited to get to share what I know about Graywater and make it seem less scary, because I think there's a certain threshold to implement it, and people might think about it and then, for whatever reason, feel intimidated and stop. But hopefully, after hearing the presentation tonight and knowing the resources that you have with your local water agency, you'll feel emboldened to continue. So a little bit more about why to use Graywater besides just the obvious one of it being a supplemental source of water. So reducing reliance on municipal, which Pamela has mentioned, which means that there's less strain on your septic tank if you're on septic or your urban treatment plant. Soil, plants, and mulch are more efficient and happen on site. We'll talk more about the mechanisms for that. So there's less energy and less chemical use. You're also recharging groundwater, allowing plant growth. Another way to help also with energy is being able to grow local food, which is helping to boost food security. With that extra water of Graywater, you might think, okay, now I can have fruit trees that you might otherwise choose not to have. And then you can have food growing in your own backyard that didn't have to get trucked in from Mexico. There's also some nutrients in the Graywater. We'll talk more about that. And those can be reclaimed and utilized on site and not removed in a treatment plant. And then finally, I think another aspect of Graywater, which is probably not really talked about as much, but is also really important, is that when you use Graywater and rainwater too, I might add, you become more aware and sensitive to natural cycles because you're observing what's going on. So you're noticing the water cycle, you're thinking about groundwater recharge, thinking about all the different things that happen in the water cycle. So that is also another benefit. So during this presentation, we're going to go through what Graywater is, Graywater system options, plumbing, getting it to the garden, planting, and then maintenance, which is always really important. So I'm going to begin by having talked about why to use Graywater, and many of you, I think, have an idea of what Graywater is. We're going to talk about what Graywater is. So by code, Graywater is the wastewater from your fixtures that produce lightly used wash water, laundry, bathroom sink, lap sink, shower, and tub. And I think when I first started working with Graywater, I realized that it's not just a name, it's actually a color. So in contrast to Graywater, we have what isn't Graywater, which is black water. Toilet water is clearly black water, that's wastewater. Dishwasher and kitchen sink is actually considered dark gray, not quite as black as toilet water. And neither of these are available in the code. Certainly toilet water wouldn't be. In certain places, I believe Arizona and Hawaii, you can use kitchen sink Graywater with certain precautions to remove, it includes a grease trap, but dishwasher water can't be used for irrigation in your garden because the detergents that are needed to get your glassware looking nice and clear have a lot of salts. And so again, Graywater is going to be water which is fairly clean, but also can't be stored, as we'll talk about. So in Chapter 15 of the California Plumbing Code, there's certain requirements, and these requirements apply both for a permitted system and a non-permitted system, such as the system we're going to focus on tonight, which is a laundry to landscape. So even with a laundry to landscape, you still need to follow code. Very, very important. So you always have to have a diverter valve. We'll talk more about that. But the reason is very clear. Right now, for example, we've had a lot of rain. And when you have a lot of rain, your plants are already getting enough water. You want to turn that valve to send that gray water to a septic or sewer so you don't overwhelm your plants. And also, furthermore, another important requirement of the code is you don't want any gray water running off your property. You don't want rainwater running off your property either, but with gray water, it's more critical because that gray water may have or will have some bacteria in it that if it's released into the soil below 2 inches of mulch, it will be treated on site. But if it runs off, then it could potentially cause harm, although there's been no evidence for that, but it's still very important to keep it on site. And so that's an important reason for using the diverter valve and also sizing your distribution area, which we'll talk more about. So then again, no ponding or runoff, and also located only on your property with proper setbacks as defined by code. But the most important ones are the diverter valve, not storing that gray water for more than 24 hours and releasing it under mulch. Gray water, again, has to be released under mulch, preferably mulch, not rock. We'll talk more about that. It may not be sprayed, therefore that's kind of saying the same thing. There is an exception to that if the gray water is treated, but we don't recommend that, and that's not relevant to a laundry system. So many people think we have these myths about, oh my gosh, we're in drought and we shouldn't be using water, so let's put in a xeriscape, which is essentially a xeriscape. It might be gravel and a few succulents or DG. And that's really not appropriate in an urban landscape. We need to have plants and soil that can infiltrate water and have that sponge that Pamela was talking about. A water-wise landscape is going to be able to collect rainwater. You can see a little pop-up here coming from a downspout over here, and some mulch and some plants, which are going to fill in over time. So using rainwater and then gray water as a supplemental source, you don't need to have a xeriscape. You can have plantings on your site, and it can actually be quite beautiful. How much gray water is available? So laundry gray water, these days, many people have front-loading washers, and this says 10 to 35 gallons per load, but more typically for a residential washer that you would go and buy currently, it's going to be more like 10 gallons per load. If you have a top loader, if you have an older top loader, it might be 50 gallons per load. But again, if you bought a new one, probably more like 20 to 25. And these numbers are based on two things. One is the volume of the washer in cubic feet, and the other one is the water factor. And you can find those numbers, the water factors for different model numbers on, I think it's energy.gov. Can give you that information, and you can basically look at the information about the washer, and you can also try to look that up. But that's basically what it's based on, is those two numbers. So if you have an existing shower and you haven't replaced the shower head recently or gotten a new one from your water agency, the flow rate is typically 2 gallons per minute. So in your shower bathtubs and bathroom sink, you're going to be producing more water than with your laundry. The newer ones or replacement ones are going to be 1.8 gallons per minute by code. But in any case, with a typical 10-minute shower, that's 18 to 20 gallons per day per person. So that's a lot of water. Bathtub, depending on how full it's going to be, could be 35 gallons, could be less if you're just running a small bathtub for a child, could be more if you're filling a really beautiful clawfoot tub. So it could be quite a lot of water. Your lav faucets are by code 1.2 gallons per minute, but you can also use an aerator to reduce that. By code, you have to actually come up with calculations that really boost up how much gray water you have to account for if you were doing more than just that laundry to landscape. It's actually based on the number of bedrooms. So when you submit your project with the plans, if you have 2 bedrooms, for example, you'd have to account for 3 occupants, with 25 gallons per day per occupant for shower and lab sinks, and 15 gallons per day per occupant for laundry, which is a little on the high side. But if you have a larger distribution area, that's actually not harmful because you have more area for that water to infiltrate. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about different types of options for gray water systems. Again, focusing on laundry, but just giving you an idea of what else is available. So I'm going to talk a little bit about 5 different system options. Again, focusing on laundry to landscape, which does not require a permit, so it's readily accessible and inexpensive. Requiring a permit, the simplest is a gravity distribution for shower and or sink. And this can work really well if you happen to have a crawl space and plantings that are downhill from the house. That can be a very simple system. If you have a situation where maybe you have a laundry and you have a big household and you're doing a lot of laundry, but your irrigation area is uphill, then you can do a simple system with a pump and the same kind of distribution that we'll talk about to get that water uphill. To go a little bit further, if you have a landscape where you want to actually use drip irrigation, then you would again use a pump but have to add additional filtration. And then finally, I just wanted to mention this because people see these online and ask about it. There are systems available that can be used for indoor use, such as flushing toilets, and can also be used for spray irrigation. And they have to meet a standard called NSF ANSI 350. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So here's just a breakdown of the systems I just mentioned. So a laundry to landscape, which is the one we're going to focus on, 250 is really at the low end. You'd have to have like some parts on hand. But, depending on how you do this, somewhere in this range. So that $200 to $400 rebate from Valley Water is very helpful. A shower system can also be low cost. Again, you have a three-way valve, and we'll come back to talking about these in more detail, but you always have to have that three-way valve, that diverter valve, so you can switch between the garden or septic or sewer. And then you have a distribution using now totally by gravity. So this is using ABS pipe with these branch drain splitters that go to mulch basins. And if you just split it a couple of times and have large mulch basins, it can be fairly inexpensive as well, or it can be more expensive depending on how big it is. And then again, if you happen to have the irrigation area uphill, you can have a simple pumped system. And so again, you'd have your diverter valve, you'd have your shower, your bath, whatever you're collecting from, maybe even a whole house situation. And then you'd have, in this case, the water would flow into the surge tank instead of directly out into the landscape, into the irrigation system. And then again, you would have the same type of distribution, which we'll talk more about in a moment. And then if you wanted more conventional landscape and you just didn't want to have mulch basins, then you can do a pumped Graywater system with dripper line with additional filtration. That's going to cost you more. And then I wanted just to include a slide because people have questions about this. There are systems out there. I would be very dubious about them. I've been dealing with these over the years. Here's one that I just found that meet this NSF ANSI standard. And they're typically like a big box, like a big, really pretty like silver box, which is like someplace in your house. And essentially all of the gray water goes into that system and then gets treated and then goes back to the fixtures, goes back to to flush the toilets and also outside for irrigation. The problem is that these systems can work really well for commercial, but the residential ones just really aren't there yet, at least not in California or the US in my experience. So I really caution against using these, especially since, as we've discussed, for most people, if they're going to use half of their water outdoors anyway, there's really no reason to have this kind of system unless you, again, have like a really large household and maybe a small irrigation area and you really want to use that water to flush toilets. So don't be tempted. Focus on simpler systems, which also allow you to keep the water on site without treating it. Okay, so I want to just go through this clothes washer system in a little bit more detail right here with this slide. And then as we go through the different parts of the talk, you'll hear about each of these different parts in more detail. So the clothes washer system basically has four parts. There's the indoor plumbing, which has this three-way valve, and then it also has an air gap so that there's no suction. There's basically an anti-siphon. And that typically can be, and you'll see this in a later slide of parts, but just get a Studer vent at Home Depot, very simple, to break that siphon. And then The hose from the laundry goes into the middle of that three-way valve, and then you have a choice to go either to sewer septic or to the landscape, again with this anti-siphon. And then from there, it goes into the irrigation piping. So that's the first part again is the indoor plumbing. And then the second part is the outdoor plumbing, which starts with PVC and then gets converted to 1-inch polyethylene or HDPE pipe, which is much better for the environment. And you'll see more slides showing that. It also allows you to curve instead of having rigid corners, and eliminates the need for things like 90s and 45s, which is also beneficial. And then when you get to where you have a plant that you want to support, you have a T, which goes from 1 inch down to ½ inch. And then you have little flow control valves under valve covers in these mulch basins. And this is just depicting, you might be irrigating a tree or a vine or some other like shrubs or different types of other plantings with your gray water. The third component that I want to mention, and you'll see examples of this, but it's very, very important, and that's the mulch basins. So mulch is not here just to prevent weed growth or to hold water. It's actually here as a water treatment. So basically, mulch is treating both biologically and mechanically. It's treating mechanically as coarse filtration for things like hair and lint, and biologically with the microbes in that mulch that are breaking down nutrients and skin cells and other organic material that's in that gray water. And the mulch basins also serve to slow sink and spread that water before the plants take it up, and also to take in the salts. And so the beauty of these mulch basins is that you can have plants that might be a little bit sensitive to gray water as long as they're not right next to that mulch basin, because the water is treated by the time the plant takes it up into its roots. And then the fourth component, of course, is the plants themselves, which we'll talk about in more detail later in this talk. So in looking at laundry to landscape systems, I want to just break down some pros and cons. So pros, we've talked about some of these already. No permit is required, which is fantastic because those permits can be hard to get. Believe me, we've been pulling them for years. They also do not impact existing plumbing, and that's an actual requirement for them. They can be implemented regardless of whether your house is on a slab or crawl space, which is very important since a lot of newer homes are built on slab. The parts are readily available from Home Depot, your local plumbing supply store. They're low maintenance, and it's the lowest cost system. There are a few cons as well. Again, with those front loading washers, you may not have that much water. It could be, as small as like 20 to 40 gallons a week, but still enough to support something that you might not otherwise be able to grow. Some limited use of non-compatible products, although this is really not a big issue for laundry because most people are already used to using the liquid high concentration, very efficient laundry soaps and aren't using Tide and bleach and things like that. But you do have to use some precautions, and we'll talk more about that. And then I think the other thing that's important to know is that laundry water it's basically cleaner than shower water. There's not things like skin cells or hair in it, or at least much less. But it tends to be saltier and also more alkaline because of the detergents. And so that's a drawback, and that restricts a little bit what plants it likes to be used for. And depending on your system in particular, using a laundry gray water system of the kind that we're talking about is relying on the pump in the washer. And so especially if you don't design your system well, it may shorten that pump life. So now coming back to the gray water rebate, I wanted just to mention this briefly because first of all, the verbiage is fantastic. Again, kudos to Valley Water. So you can receive either $200 or $400 to install a laundry to landscape gray water system. And these qualifications are actually really great and really helpful. So it has to be accessible near an exterior wall or above a crawl space. And the reality is, and they may be able to accept this, but I mean, if your washer is, say it's in a room near the garage, you can run a pipe like into the garage and then outside. And I'm sure they would accept that if you had that carefully drawn out. But in general, you want to be near an exterior wall or above a crawl space, and then you just go down into the crawl space and then out. First gray water outlet is 50 feet or less, or a bit further if downhill. And this This basically, again, relates to that Graywater, that laundry washer pump. You want to preserve the pump and make sure the system doesn't just work for the first 6 months, but continues to work for years. So again, the landscape needs to be the same elevation or downhill. And then you want to prioritize decorative trees, fruit trees, shrubs, et cetera, et cetera. And then this is also mentioned in the setback. So really beautifully done, and more information on their website. I wanted also just to mention another way to do a laundry to landscape system, which wouldn't give you a rebate through Valley Water, but might make sense on your property, and also explains better how a gravity shower system works. Any gravity system is going to be using larger pipe size, starting with 2-inch ABS, and then it can drop down to 1.5 inch. And you just have these flow splitters. So you would split it in half first, and then typically you don't want to split it more than twice. And so you would end up then with 4 mulch basins, although you could just make like 1 or 2 very large ones. And kind of an interesting option that can work well for some people, depending on like what their situation is you can just move the washer hose between standpipes, between one to the garden and one to sewer, or you can, in some cases I've seen where people have multiple standpipes. So you might have one standpipe that goes out to one set of trees, and one goes to another, and then it becomes like a very simple system to install and use that water. And again, it has to be 2 inches below release 2 inches below mulch and following all of the requirements, but can be a great system. Okay, so now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the plumbing. We talked about how in the laundry to landscape system we have indoor plumbing and outdoor plumbing. The indoor plumbing is basically these 2 components plus the fittings that you need to connect the washer hose here at the middle, and then your pipe to either back to the sewer or septic or out to the garden. The line that goes out to the garden is going to include an air gap. And these this is a Studer vent, which you can get at Home Depot. Very simple way to add an air gap to the system. So that's the key parts for the indoor plumbing. Everything else you can just find at Home Depot or an irrigation supply store. And then the outdoor plumbing includes the poly pipe, which again starts with 1 inch and then drops down to 1/2 inch at each of the basins. So you have these fittings, which are T's, and this one isn't showing it, but typically you would have 1 inch to 1/2 inch, and then you'd have 1/2 inch running to the basin. And then we use these really cool little barbed flow control valves so that you can adjust how much water goes to each basin. And these are under valve boxes, and this is all placed in the mulch basin. And you can pop the cover off the valve box and then adjust the flow to each basin. Why would you use a diverter valve? I mentioned earlier, when you have a lot of rain, you don't want to overwhelm your landscape. You definitely don't want to have any runoff of gray water. So it's a really good reason to turn that system to the sewer or septic. If you, for some reason, really want to use bleach, you definitely don't want to send that to the garden. Poopy diapers, if it just a little bit of poop gets in there, nothing to really worry about because it's going to be treated by the mulch, but not something to do routinely. You might have a situation where you need to keep the laundry sanitary, but the main thing are things like bleach or anything toxic that you don't want to go into your garden, or having just too much water already in the garden. You're going to want to divert that water. But again, as I mentioned earlier, if you design your system well, most of the time, unless there's torrential rain, multi-day rain, it's totally fine because you have a large enough area that you can infiltrate that gray water in addition to the rain. The location needs to be easily accessible. It's typically just behind the washer or next to it. The vent, that Studer vent that I mentioned, that can be right above the washer, or it can be, you can go through the wall and have it outside. They do make kind of a burping sound, so depending on the location, you might want that outside. There's some aesthetics here. There's really cool ways you can put these into a cabinet so that it's not so visible. If your washer is in an area that you want to have looking nicer, there's a lot of different options, but you want to make sure it's secured, ideally braced to a stud, and then you're going to connect to the existing drain, and then you want to also label the directions. And again, as I mentioned, the side going to the garden would be the side with this air gap. and you want to label that. And you can also have a sign, and then this pipe is going to go back to the sewer. Distribution pathway, typically you're going to use 1-inch Schedule 40 coming out of the house and then convert to 1-inch poly as soon as possible. This kind of thing we really try to avoid, but there can be a situation where you do end up having to route the pipe around the building. But if you do, you want to be very, very careful to strap it so that it's not a tripping hazard. And be careful for electrical, and really try to minimize 90-degree turns. If you have to do one, maybe use 45s. And then a great solution is to use a cover like this so that you can run out to a distribution area without cutting the concrete. Maybe you do that in the future when you're ready to redo this sidewalk here. This is an example of do not store gray water. It becomes black. We talked earlier about gray and black, and they really are real colors. And so, yeah, if gray water is not used within 24 hours, it gets nasty. The bacteria that are in it divide and propagate, and it's not a pleasant sight. And this is another reason to avoid surge tanks unless you have really good maintenance or a system that cleans it, et cetera, et cetera. I'm just throwing this in here just to kind of blow your mind a little bit about what's possible, and especially because we're going to be talking more about including rainwater as well as gray water. Showers are great, as I mentioned, because it's more water per usage than laundry. We have a surfing culture, and so people that surf love having an outdoor shower. This is a pretty easy retrofit. And you can have the discharge from the shower go right into just a simple little surge tank with a pump, and then that basic simple system to flood irrigation. So you'd have the laundry to landscape type system with the flow control valves irrigating. In this case, it was some fruit trees. But the other thing that's super cool here is that you can have, especially if you have a small rainwater system, it may be mainly overflowing to a rain garden or being used with a hose to deep water some things. But you have the option of connecting that to this gray water tank. And so you can flush the lines with the rainwater, and you can also use that same pump to pump rainwater. So just a kind of novel way to use gray water without going through the whole house. Okay, so as promised, laundry products are very important. So what's really critical is to exclude these things, which are very non-plant friendly: sodium, borax, and bleach. There's things, if you read the labels carefully, you might see things like biocompatible, but you want to not just be fooled by a name that says all natural. You want to actually read the ingredients and see. You don't want to see sodium as a top ingredient. It might be a little bit, but you definitely don't want that to be high on the list. You might get some of these ingredients that are in fertilizer. Most detergents now do not have phosphates in them. The Oasis one, which is designed for laundry, actually does have a little bit of potassium, which plants like. You may get some of these nutrients also from any organic material or skin cells. But if you do, it's just beneficial nutrients that can be utilized on site and not going to a treatment center. And if you do need a fabric softener, vinegar is great. Won't be a problem in the landscape. Okay, so now we're going to talk about getting that gray water into the garden. So the distribution area is very important. I mentioned earlier that by code, it's sized based on the number of occupants, the number of bedrooms, and an estimation of how much water they're producing. But you can also measure it by percolation rate, so you know how much water your particular soil can infiltrate. Again, it's very important to use living mulch and not gravel because, as I mentioned, the mulch actually does have both mechanical and biological treatment, whereas gravel is not going to do. It might do a little bit of filtration, but it's basically just going to be not offering any benefit, and you will have odor with gravel as well, which is unpleasant. You need to protect the outlets from clogging, and if possible, you always want to route rainwater into the distribution area wherever possible, and make sure that the overflows from the basins are safe. So you can measure for the distribution area a couple of different ways, and one is percolation. And to do this, you just basically dig a hole in where the basin is going to be, fill that with water twice to make sure that it's saturated, and then measure how long it takes for 1 inch to percolate or infiltrate. Based on this infiltration method, if you're looking for a maximum daily rate of 50 gallons, you're going to need about 20 square feet if you have a fast rate. And if you have a slower rate, it can go up to 100 square feet. And what this corresponds to is soil texture. And by code, you actually have to measure the soil texture if you're applying for a permit. Again, if you're doing a laundry system, you don't have to apply for a permit, but you do want to know what your soil texture is. And you can kind of do both. You can measure the infiltration, and you can also examine the soil texture or do a ribbon test. There's some things you can do. But just to point out that 20 square feet would correspond to sandy loam, and the faster rates in that 0 to 30 would be things like sand and gravel. As you get more clay, you're going to need a larger area for distribution for that infiltration. So it's kind of a combination, again, of the texture and the percolation rate, which are both telling you essentially the same thing. So clay soils are awesome because they tend to hold more carbon, and part of what we're trying to do with these planted areas is to sequester carbon. However, they also accumulate salts, so pros and cons, but there's a solution, which is capturing rainwater to flush the salts. And rainwater, of course, is the perfect flush because our tap water is actually fairly salty, but rainwater is essentially salt-free, very soft, and so it's the perfect thing to flush. And that's why that system I showed you with the rain tank and the shower, having the rainwater to flush through those lines is the ultimate flush, even though you might use city water if you didn't have rainwater. So a mulch basin is very similar to how you would design a rain garden. You want to make sure it's away from the foundation, and it's going to be basically the depth of your small valve cover. So 4 to 10 inches deep, or about the depth of a 1 gallon plant. And the mulch has to be at least 2 inches deep by code. So infiltration basins before mulch and plantings are going to be holding a lot of water between storms or to catch the rainwater. But once they're planted, you can see that all that water is infiltrating and supporting these plants. And again, this is showing both graywater and rainwater. Another example, and here you can actually see what I was talking about earlier. So this is the 1 inch poly. We love to use poly in the landscape for several reasons. One is that it's recyclable. Just a lot less toxic than PVC, which over time can leach phthalates and things like that we don't want in our soil. But also, the 1 inch poly can be curved and eliminate the need for so many fittings, which is also going to be less expensive and better for the flow of the water. So there's many reasons to use poly. And the way these are done, again, we use these tees to bush down to 1/2 inch, and then we have the 1/2 inch flow control valves under these covers, which then you can adjust. Typically, with a laundry system, the valve that's closest to the washer is going to be mostly closed, and the one that's farthest away is going to be more fully open. But the beauty of the system is that you can also adjust it depending upon the basin. You might have a basin that's supporting a tree that needs more water, so that one you might leave a little bit more open. So that's a big advantage of this kind of system that is really great. And you can see in this picture that here's our rainwater pop-up, and this green pop-up, basically, if you're not familiar with it, you can get these at a landscape supply store like Site One. This middle part pops up when water is flowing, but when water's not flowing, it pops back down. So there's no possibility of rodents getting in there or mosquitoes getting in there and propagating larvae, which you don't want, obviously. So those are great. And you can see here's another one right here. And you can see here also in this picture now the valve cover off, and you can see the little greenback, which again, like I said, you open up to balance. And again, you want to co-locate these as much as possible, but of course you also want to really think about your catchment area as well as your graywater basin. So you design the graywater basin based on the maximum graywater expectation per day. but you have to make sure that you've allowed for enough area for the catchment area of the roof or the overflow from a tank as well, because again, you don't want any of your rainwater leaving the site or any of your gray water leaving the site. So I wanted to include a specific slide about the Valley Water rainwater rebates, having just talked about combining rainwater and gray water, even though today's talk is primarily on gray water. But I just love that Valley Water offers these specific rebates. And Nick mentioned these earlier, but I wanted just to pop this slide up real quick and show you that, yes, indeed, you can get up to $35 per rain barrel. And 50 cents per gallon for a cistern, which that would be $500 for a 1,000-gallon tank, which is going to cover a pretty good amount of, like, probably half the cost of that tank. So it's a great rebate. And then for a rain garden, which you can like dig with your friends and neighbors, this is also really helpful. And that would also help cover the pipe coming from your downspout, converting the downspout to 3-inch drain pipe, and your pop-up, which are actually kind of expensive, and so forth, and then some plants even. So very helpful. Thank you, Valley Water. And this is just showing that same landscape having now filled in. And I wanted just to give another example. So this is an example of not a residential, but it could be also used for an HOA or something like that. If there's a situation with a shared laundry facility, there's a possibility to get more water for irrigation. So this is at a church camp. We did this with some volunteers at the church camp. It was really fun, and we used 2 of these washers. One irrigates an almond orchard shown here, and the other one irrigates an orchard with other fruit trees. And we're anticipating about 600 gallons a week for these 2 systems. So they're seeing fruits and almonds that they hadn't seen for years. So it's very, very satisfying to use the water in that way. And again, that could be done for a larger household or multifamily household. Okay, so now we're going to talk about planting a graywater garden. So choosing plants that love graywater. So when you think about plants that love graywater, there's basically 3 really important things to think about. One is that the plants are fine with getting additional water or fine to be wet. So you don't want plants that are like a Dudley or something like that, which wants no water at all in the summer and doesn't want much water. Many succulents don't love gray water. So that's the first thing, is loving water. And then the second thing is plants that are okay with things being a little salty. So this could be plants that are adapted to being by the seaside, so they've gotten some salt spray, or plants that have just adapted to being more, having saltier soil. And then kind of along with that is also plants that can tolerate more alkaline conditions. And this is particularly important for laundry gray water, which tends to have a slightly higher pH than your tap water because of the detergent. So those are the 3 things to think about. Roses actually are amazing. I've used them in a number of different situations, and they're an example of something that people love, that's, that actually works well with gray water. Here's some others. Lily of the Nile, agapanthus. This is also great because it can take partial shade. Daylilies, canna, fortnight lily. And then another way that you can use gray water, again, in a situation that you might not otherwise maybe feel that you could irrigate, is you just really want a privacy hedge for some reason, for some like part of your yard or for your driveway, so your neighbors or whoever's delivering things doesn't see into your property. You can have a gray water system that irrigates an entire hedge of privet, which works well, or star jasmine. And in this case, you might use a dripper line, or you could, there's a lot of different ways you could do this, or you could do a laundry landscape type system, depending upon the situation, and have a series of basins. But again, gray water can work really well in this kind of context. And then vines are also great. Many vines are great. Certain grapes will work really well, other decorative vines. And this can also be a really lovely addition for privacy or just, kind of mood enhancement in your yard. And then, of course, fruit trees, which I mentioned earlier. Fruit trees pretty much all love gray water. The only exception is avocado, which I'll talk about in a moment. But fruit trees generally are fantastic. And it's a great opportunity to grow food in your yard, but also to grow fruit trees that some of which you may not be able to find at the store, some more unusual fruits. Anna apples are an apple tree that can be grown locally that are really delicious and love gray water, for example. Sapote, guava, you can get into some exotic types of fruits. And pretty much all of these are going to be very successful. Any citrus is great. Figs, bananas, oh my gosh, bananas are insane. And you can grow like little finger bananas. Landscape trees are another option, which again can be great to include in your design. And then you want to make sure that you avoid plants that do not like gray water. And this is going to be either plants that don't like too much water or are sensitive to salt or alkalinity. So, for example, blueberries really like acidic soil, and so they're kind of hard to grow actually in our climate. Other plants that are decorative that are very pH sensitive are again things that are really fun to grow, like azaleas, hydrangea, camellia, rhododendron. These are all plants that really like acidic soil, so they are not good choices for gray water. And avocado is very salt sensitive, so it's a bit tricky. It can be used with gray water, but with plenty of rainwater and city water supplementation. Very cautious with avocado. Salvias do not like gray water, and many succulents don't like gray water. But some succulents just plump up and they're fine with it. And as Pamela mentioned earlier on, many native plants do well with gray water. And a lot of this is going to be empirical. I can't remember all the different ones that I've done. I know many of the more riparian plants like juncus and things like that, but also ceanothus, which is a fun one in the landscape, actually really likes gray water. It will just be brighter. The flowers are brighter and it really likes getting some extra water. So some experimentation is good, but again, being aware of salt, alkalinity, and things that just really don't like water. And then you can kind of go from there. Ground covers are not appropriate for gray water. Most ground covers really do best with spray irrigation. So that could work if you have, a whole house treatment system, which again, I don't recommend for residential because it's not doing all the things we're talking about as far as using water on site without treating it, without using energy. Like all those things go out the door with that kind of a system. So ground covers, therefore, are really not appropriate for gray water. Raised planters are not going to be a good idea. If you have a large enough raised planter and you have it's just a situation where maybe it's downhill and you can come through the side of it or something like that, you might be able to get it to work. But in general, it's not going to be a great idea. And also it's going to be hard to keep that water from pooling inside that raised planter. So just not a good idea. Root vegetables, not appropriate and also not allowed by code because you're having to dig into the soil that has gray water in it to harvest those. They may have some contamination. Leafy greens, also not appropriate because, again, you're handling it. But along those lines, interestingly, some people are having success with perennial collards and may also work for kale. They're called tree collards. So if you have something like that, I mean, there's ways to get around these things. If you have a perennial leafy green, where you're not having to replant it and dig into the ground, that could work fine with gray water. But in general, if you're growing, other kinds of leafy greens, it's not going to be a good idea. Here's just some before and after. So here you can see, again, combining, you can see the rainwater pop up and you can see the basins for the gray water system. And as it fills in first in July, a few months later, and then a year later, really beautiful conversion. And you can see here's the rainwater tank. So this landscape has now become not a xeriscape at all, but a beautiful watershed-wise landscape. again here before Graywater, 2 years later. And again, we're seeing beautiful plantings with mulch basins, and then an area in the middle to use for whatever else. Conventional, not very healthy lawn converted to a beautiful graywater and rainwater landscape. And you can see in these pictures too that there's a mix of plants. There's definitely some natives in here. So it's just like being careful about how you plant things and remembering that with mulch basins, the water's going to be filtered. And so there's going to be quite a range of plants that you can use depending on how you place them. And then again, of course, edible trees and more tropical kinds of gardens become accessible. Things like bananas, like I mentioned, and other delicious fruit trees. And then finally, last but not least, maintenance. Very, very important for a graywater system. Outlets can get clogged. If you have any outlets, the initial outlet coming out of the house, where you might have a flush port or something like that, can get filled with roots. And when you have those valve covers in mulch basins, they can get filled with dirt. Gophers can think it's really fun that there's this basin and they can get in there and you open your valve cover and it's just full of dirt. So these need to be checked annually and rebalanced. And then also adding more mulch, which I'll come back to. You can install a hose flush in line, where you can then just attach a hose and run that through the system with higher pressure than coming out of the washer, and open the end of the line and run the system, or just open the end of the line and run the system, or attach the hose and just flush it, opening up each of the flush ports. So a couple of different ways you can do this, making sure that all of your flush ports, all of your flow control valves in each of your basins are working properly and balanced. You may also find that the water is just kind of sitting in the basins and not percolating. And if that happens, you want to make sure that you get any sediment out and keep adding fresh mulch. So that should be part of your annual maintenance. Remember again that mulch is really actively treating the graywater. It's not just there to look pretty. It's working hard. And because of that, it's going to need to be replaced and having more added frequently. And that's it for my presentation. I'd love to hear if you have any questions that didn't get answered in the chat. Yeah, thank you for your interest.
You want to just go to the next slide?
Yes.
There you go. Right? So the great thing is that all these classes that we've done with Valley Water are available on YouTube, and we put a link earlier in the chat, and we'll put another link there. You can watch tonight's recording again and also these other classes. And then I think, what's the last one here? Is that the last slide? That's the next class. Put it on your calendar now and make sure you are absolutely available March 26th. So that's perfect. Okay, so if you would thank you, Anna, for launching the evaluation poll. I want to recommend, we have some time to take questions, and there were some really good questions. Do you want to go ahead and stop sharing?
Yeah.
And then, what will happen here? Let's see. I'll tell you what, I'm going to do this. And then I'm going to, what's happening? What's happening? Let's see. There we go. Sorry about that. Technology. All right. Well, we had some awesome questions, actually. And I'm very glad that you spent time discussing the mulch basins and how they are active filtration for graywater, because they are also active filtration for rainwater. And then, if you take the mulch out of your basin, you replace it once a year, let's say, what would you do with that mulch? Where would you put that?
I would compost it.
Yeah, run it through a composter, worst case scenario, spread it out,
Mhm, mhm.
throughout the top dressing on the landscape.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Someone has just asked a question, which I think you've addressed, and I would love for you to reiterate.
Mhm.
The question of, can you use gravel as mulch in the basins? That way it doesn't have to be replaced.
Well, the gravel doesn't do the job that we need. And so I recommend very strongly not to use gravel because it does not treat the gray water. And so the plants will suffer, and you will actually have some odor of the gray water sitting in that gravel basin. Not strong, but you will notice it. So definitely not a good idea.
I mean, gravel can get stinky even if it doesn't have gray water in it.
That's true. Yeah,
It's
yeah, yeah.
so one of the things that we really like to emphasize with the Watershed Wise landscape is that we want it to be a living landscape, which means everything that we do is enhancing biological activity, good biological activity, aerobic biological activity. And that means that we want things to decompose, and we want lots of plants to have their roots in the ground, working with biology. So that means limiting decomposed granite, limiting gravel in the landscapes, sticking with things like mulch, plant materials, ground covers, and so forth. So thanks for highlighting that.
Yeah.
We had a question very early on about structured wetlands, and I know that is not really what we're talking about here. I said you're going from the 101 class, which is tonight, to the PhD level seminar. But I know that you have some experience thinking about them, and I thought maybe just a word or two. There was a question about, are there any standard designs? And I don't know of any, but you may know more.
I have been involved with that a little bit. It's been a while. I think wetlands make the most sense when you're treating whole house wastewater, not just gray water. In our landscape, to treat gray water in a wetland doesn't really make sense, just because of the nature of our landscapes, especially in someone's backyard. But I think there are some designs out there, but I think if you're using it in a yard situation, it really doesn't make sense because the mulch basins will already treat it sufficiently for the use if you're using it to grow food and to grow landscape plants. There's no reason to do that. The only reason to do that is if you're wanting to clean it up for some other kind of application. And like, for example, a blackwater wetland can treat the water sufficiently that then it can be used in a more conventional kind of landscape. So that's my 2 cents worth on that.
Yeah. When I think of constructed wetland, I think of like an HOA doing it, or, a large area.
Right. Yeah. The example that I was involved with was actually a monastery. I don't remember what kind it was, but they had because they had this kind of system in the past, they were allowed to do it, even though it'd be hard to get a permit for most people. And it's actually very interesting. I didn't get to continue with it, but just the choices of plants and things like that. But yeah, but they had the space to do it. You need some space. So that's another.
Yeah, and you need the soils engineer.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
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 Okay. So there was also another question about potassium. Someone had a water softener and was wondering about potassium salts versus sodium salts. And I said, well, look, even though tell me if I'm wrong, I might be, or needs explanation. So that potassium is essentially a fertilizer material. Mm-hmm. We really are trying to avoid having any chemicals going into
Absolutely.
the landscape.
Yeah.
Because that disrupts the biological system.
Yeah, totally. I mean, a little bit of, I think there's a little bit of potassium in that Oasis detergent. In a small amount would be okay, but from a water softener, the brine from that, even if it's potassium, is going to be very bad for the landscape. I would not recommend putting that into gray water, certainly. So
Yeah, yeah, that's an issue. So okay, also, can you weigh in on soap nuts? I'll bet you're a huge fan. I'm not a fan, but I have really dirty laundry. I get sunscreen,
yeah,
on
yeah.
things, and
No,
I still take it off with
I
soap
know
nuts.
people use soap nuts. I don't see any reason to use soap nuts personally because I find that these liquid detergents work really well and they're biocompatible and they also get my clothes clean. And I live pretty dirty. I'm a mountain biker and all that stuff. So yeah, and sunscreen and mud and all the things. So soap nuts just aren't enough. But some people swear by them. But I mean, I think they might have been a really great option in years past when there just really weren't many detergents out there that really were
Yeah,
good in your garden. Now there's a lot of choices, so
yeah,
you don't have to go with soap nuts. But
yeah. It's
you
it's
can,
great.
yeah,
You can if you really, really
you can
want
if you
to.
want to, yeah.
Okay. So I'm not exactly sure about this question. I'll try to frame it up. Is there a comparison of that we know of, like a
Mm.
study of microplastics in organic produce versus gardening for food and using gray water? Because there could be microplastics in gray water. Um, so do you know of any studies? I mean,
I don't, but I mean, I think the beauty of gray water is that any microplastics that were in your laundry water are going to be, going into the mulch basin, so they won't be in the food.
yeah, they're
The
not in,
water will be filtered. So I mean, I think actually, even though there can be microplastics, depending on what kind of clothing you are washing, if you're wearing some synthetic clothing, there will be some microplastics. But that's another great reason actually to have a gray water system is that the microplastics um, are not going into the sewer. They're going into your garden, and so yeah, your food is going to be much freer from them. I would say, yeah. I don't know if
yeah,
anybody's studied it, but just understanding how a mulch basin works, it seems pretty clear that that yeah, the food is going to be much freer of microplastics.
yeah. But you know what? The thing is, the whole thing about pollution of any kind,
Mm-hmm.
really, that we talk about with rainwater also is holding it on your property
Exactly. Yeah.
so
Exactly.
that
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
the concentration of any one thing is very, very low,
Mm-hmm.
and you build a really robust ecological system, and the biology manages
Yeah. Yeah.
almost every pollutant that I have heard of,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
can
Without
be
a doubt.
managed
Yeah.
by plants with phytoremediation or the
Mm-hmm.
biology in the soil,
Mm-hmm. Yep.
including
Yep.
breaking down plastics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this is a great reason to focus on healthy soil,
Yeah.
number one,
Absolutely. Yeah.
which
Yeah.
a lot of organics don't. So there's the
Right.
comparison.
Yes. Yes.
So we
Definitely.
have time for a few more questions. Is there a list that can be accessed to assure that mature growth trees aren't negatively affected by gray water? Or is there a study or some kind of a, thing to think about with mature growth trees? I mean, can I take a stab? I mean, my
Yeah. Yeah.
stab would be, okay, you don't discharge water under a canopy of any tree.
Right. Right. Absolutely.
Uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
Rainwater, irrigation, unless it's really managed. Um, you're not concentrating, you're not building any kind of pit
Right.
under the canopy of any
Yeah.
tree.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
And so therefore, with a mature tree, you're going to be out beyond the canopy, beyond the drip line with any
Mm-hmm.
mulch basin. And the likelihood of impacting that tree negatively so long as you are sticking with the biocompatible soaps and so
Mhm.
forth, and you're over applying. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, if
Yeah.
if you're running a commercial laundry in your laundry, or doing multiple loads every single day, it is not appropriate for anything,
Definitely. Yeah. Definitely. I mean, a case,
especially not a mature tree.
right. I mean, a case in point along those lines is oak trees, which in general do not like gray water, but definitely need water. And having a rain garden on your property, for example, is going to help support those, and probably some gray water too, if it's, again, at a distance away. And there's some thought that having more water resilience for our oak trees, which are suffering from gold spotted oak borer, would help them be more resilient to that pest, as long as it's not getting dumped right on them. So I think that's just an example. So I think, yeah, having gray water on site, but not under the canopy at a distance, then it's available for the tree to reach and get what it needs, but that's been filtered and but without inundating it. So yeah, that would be my thought too. But yeah, you're not going to irrigate it directly.
Yeah. Yeah, those are great questions. Well, this has just been a terrific, I think there's a question about recommendations for detergents. Oasis is probably
The
the
best choice, yeah.
best.
Mhm.
It's been around the longest, the most tried and true and tested. But if you read the labels of, there are many new detergent makers, and so
Yeah.
if you read the labels, you'd really get.
Yeah, there's some good choices out there. I think you can find things at places like Costco or Trader Joe's, and you can use the Oasis as a comparison and
Yeah,
compare them. But yeah, there's some good choices out there.
yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, asking great questions. You see how this works. I hope you will come back to our classes when we start up again in the spring. And you can watch again Dr. Hasselbeck's wonderful presentation. We're really grateful to Valley Water for sponsoring these workshops and exploring these topics. And if you are interested in these topics, really finish that evaluation in the next couple seconds. And feel free to let us know if there are any topics that you'd like us to explore. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great evening and a wonderful holiday. And thank you, Dr. Hasselbeck. I appreciate it very much. Good night.